Hi everyone, my name is Dylan. I was 23 years old when I met a man who changed my life. Unfortunately, I had to become an accessory to a serious crime. I made a deal with my conscience and carried out this man's plan, and then said goodbye to him forever, taking a huge bag of money with me. I was a student, and I was struggling with life's difficulties. I had a huge student loan, I was living in a terrible dorm, and my relationship with the girl I loved was hanging by a thread. So, I was a little depressed at the time. I lived in poverty, and all that was dear to me was Jasmine. I loved her so much, and it was so painful to feel that I was gradually losing her. I tried my best to maintain our relationship, but due to a lack of money, all I could do was draw the phrase, "I love you," with chalk on the asphalt, or write a poem about her, and so on. But I couldn't afford to take Jasmine to a cafe or even to a movie. This led to frequent arguments, and I always felt bad afterward. But then, I decided to give Jasmine an expensive birthday present, a romantic trip for two. Of course, I couldn't make a lot of money that fast, and no bank would give me a loan. I was recommended to contact one person who could lend me the money. But just so you can understand, this was a man with a rather dubious reputation, and I would never have gotten involved with such a person if the love of my life wasn't at stake. Unfortunately, this romantic trip with Jasmine only prolonged our relationship for about a month, and soon afterward, she left me, leaving me alone with a mountain of problems. I ended up behind the bar in a cheap third-rate bar. No, I didn't start drinking. I worked there, and this work drove me into a severe depression. But it was there that I met the man who solved all my problems. It was a totally normal evening, and I had to close the bar at midnight. However, one customer had had a little too much to drink and was sleeping on the bar. I had gotten tired of him even before he passed out. This guy was complaining and muttering something about getting divorced from his wife the whole time. Yeah, sure, happy people don't go to these places. I woke him up and took him outside. He was barely able to stand, and I had no idea how he was going to get home. But that wasn't my concern. I was just leaving. But suddenly, I heard a car alarm, and when I looked back, I saw this guy lying next to his car. Apparently, he had just crashed into it, fallen, and broken off the side mirror. I thought he was going to have a lot of problems with this because this car was super expensive. It was a Bentley, or something like that. Suddenly, the man started yelling for help. Hell, I wanted to go home, but now my conscience wouldn't let me leave this drunk idiot alone. I wanted to call him a taxi, but he said he would give me a $1,000 tip if I took him home in his car. $1,000? That was my monthly salary. Now, I took the keys, and imagine my surprise when I realized that this luxury car belonged to this pathetic drunk. What was he doing in this godforsaken bar? Along the way, he pestered me with various questions about my life. And, I felt relieved when I told him about all my problems. He was like a free psychologist who would forget about everything in the morning. But the evening of surprises was not over yet. We arrived in an expensive area and stopped at a very cool house. Yeah, that's where he lived. Then this guy gave me my tip and invited me to come into his house. It was pretty late, and he offered to let me spend the night at his place, so I didn't need to drive across town to my dorm. So far, everything was very strange, and I didn't even understand what was happening. But I had nothing to lose, so I thought, why not? For the first time in a long time, I slept well, and I wasn't disturbed by music or shouting neighbors. Plus, the guest room was just gorgeous. But in the morning, I had another surprise waiting for me. I went down and saw a big crowd of people in the living room. It was like an anthill. They were walking around the house with a lot of papers, talking on the phone, shouting something to each other. Then my late-night visitor saw me and said that yesterday we never got to know each other. His name was Greg, and he was sorry that he'd had a little too much to drink, but he'd had too many problems yesterday. His wife started the divorce process with him, and this army of people in his house was his team of lawyers and legal experts who were handling the paperwork. Greg's wife was going to take away most of his property because she caught him cheating. Now, Because of the losses, he could lose his business, his home, his expensive car, and much more. But he could avoid it and suggested that I participate in a certain case. This job offer was his thanks for the kindness I had shown him the previous night. He shared a detailed plan of action with me and made it clear that I would be completely safe and that absolutely no one would get hurt. However, this whole plan was an insurance scam, and I wasn't going to participate in it. So I thanked him for the offer and for the tip he left me and went home. With the $1,000 he gave me, I could have lived for a month and saved the money I made to pay off my student loan. However, my plan was ruined when I returned to the dorm. My neighbor was standing at our door, and he was almost crying with fear. He was terrified. It was like he had seen a ghost. Turned out that this ghost had come to me. I went into my room and saw a complete mess. All my things were scattered around the room, and in the middle of this mess was the man who had lent me money 2 months ago. And he was not in the mood for a peaceful dialogue. He pushed me against the wall and demanded that I return his money. He was serious, and I realized that I could get really hurt at that moment. I had to give him everything I had earned the previous night. In addition, he took my laptop and my expensive headphones that Jasmine gave me a long time ago. He gave me a week to pay off the rest of my debt, or I'd be in much worse trouble. But what I gave him back then wasn't even half the amount I needed. In addition, I wouldn't receive my paycheck for another 2 weeks. So basically, I was in his pocket, and there was nothing I could do. So I had to go back to Greg's house and accept his offer. Greg was happy to have me back, and after a couple of days, everything was ready. After the divorce, Greg had to hand over an expensive collection of paintings to his wife, and he certainly didn't want to do that. But he couldn't ignore the court's decision, so we had to pull off a very dangerous scheme. The van, which was going to carry the paintings, was equipped with a special air conditioning system, and it was set up in such a way that when it was enabled, it would short-circuit and lead to a fire. The car was supposed to burn up in minutes, and the paintings would burn up with it. But the main thing in this plan was that the paintings were insured, and Greg would get a huge monetary compensation for them. But that was not all. The van would be full of fakes, and Greg would keep the real paintings. And, last but not least, I was supposed to be a driver. The plan was complicated and dangerous, but it was my only chance to make money. So we took action. But our plan almost fell apart in the first second. When we loaded the paintings into the van, Greg's ex-wife arrived at the house and said that she was going to control everything and that she would ride in the van with me. Greg couldn't talk her out of it, so she slid into the passenger seat. Greg nodded at me and told me to stick to the plan. I started the engine and we pulled out onto the road. I had to find a safe place along the route so that the fire wouldn't damage anything but the van. But Greg's ex-wife got hot after a couple of minutes, and she turned on the air conditioner herself. I wasn't supposed to let on that something was wrong, but I had to get the van to safety, so I pushed the gas pedal to the floor. No more than a minute later, the interior of the van began to fill with smoke, and my unexpected passenger began to panic and scream. Finally, I found a safe place and stopped the car. At that moment, it was impossible to breathe in the cabin. I got out of the car and saw that the van was already on fire. But a second later, I realized that Greg's ex-wife was still inside. I was still in shock when I ran back to the car, opened the door, and saw that she couldn't unfasten her seatbelt. She almost fainted from the smoke. Then I quickly pulled her out and carried her away from the fire. Thank God she was alive. About 5 minutes later, firefighters arrived at the scene, but by that time, the car had almost completely burned down, and Greg's ex-wife had almost recovered. She was just terrified of what had happened and continued to scream that her paintings were being burned. After that, there were many different interrogations and testimonies. In the end, the case was classified as an accident, and Greg got his money. That was the last time I saw him. He thanked me for the work I'd done and said I'd set $1 million worth of fire. Literally. Then Greg handed me a huge bag that was completely stuffed with bundles of money. This money was enough to pay off my entire student debt, pay off the money I owed that jerk, and have a nice, quiet life until the end of college. I also signed a document in which I promised to never talk about our fraud. But that was years ago, and I totally kept this secret. I'm an adult now, and I've never broken the law again in my life. I feel a great sense of relief that I have finally been able to reveal this terrible secret.